Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Commission on the Use of Publicly Owned Properties. And we're starting our meeting at 6:05 p.m. Today's Monday, November 18th, and we're in the Woodbridge Town Library. This will count as our Cupop meeting. So we're going to call our meeting to order, and the Cupop workshop will conduct an educational workshop this evening with our guest speaker, Jeffrey Ward, PhD, Chief Scientist, Department of Forestry and Horticulture at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station. The workshop topic will be Eradicating the Japanese Barberry and identifying other invasive species in Woodbridge. I just want to remind everyone that our next meeting is December 16th at 6:30 p.m. at the Central Meeting Room at Town Hall. Okay, without further ado, Jeff, welcome, and thank you very much
thank you, Laura.
for coming.
Yes, the topic's just a little bit different, but I'm going to cover everything you asked for.
Thank you so much more.
Yeah. So appreciate everybody coming in. You got that baby all fired up? All good. Excellent. See if I can remember how to work this. One thing I did want to thank is Scott Williams, who is the one who handles all the information I'm going to be talking today about ticks and Lyme disease in Barberry, which is a big reason why we want to control it. And hopefully I get this puppy to work. There we go. For those of you who don't know, Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station, I'll give you guys a little flyer about it, is the oldest and first experiment station in the country. It's the second oldest research institution in the world. There's one now, there's an experiment station in all 50 states, and we're the only one that's independent of the land-grant university. We do a lot of things. When you hear about someone who tests for ticks, for Lyme disease, or mosquitoes for West Nile or Triple E, we do the testing, even though public health tends to do the reports. One of the things we do, people often ask about is we do soil testing, about 17,000 samples a year. And we do it for free, and the legislators have often asked, why do we do it for free? From a financial standpoint, it actually costs as much money to charge when you have to hire new people, it's nothing else. But the big thing is by doing soil testing and having people only put down the amount of fertilizer they want, you're not having people put down extra nitrogen, extra phosphorus. And what happens when you put down an excess? It washes into our streams and into our rivers and really ruins water quality. So that's a major reason why we do that. We also have the Fern Lab, which is if there's ever a food contamination event in the Northeast, we're responsible for finding out what it is and how long it's out there. Talk about the other ones. What's kind of neat about forestry is we've been doing research since 1901 on forestry. We started out looking at American chestnut. We actually established the first state nurseries, planted or grew a few million trees. If you look at the older white pine and red pine plantations throughout the state, those are seedlings that were grown by the experiment station. What we do more recently here in my group is we look at a lot of forest ecology. In the upper left is a photo of a study that was started back in 1926 when the trees were about 2 or 3 inches in diameter. And we've been measuring close to 50,000 stems now over a 90-year period, which I think is really, really cool. We do wetland studies. We've done some prescribed burning studies. And then we do silviculture. And this is kind of a small group, so it can be a little informal here. Does anyone here ever heard of the word silviculture before? You've all heard of agriculture, right? You all heard of horticulture. Well, close to 70% of Connecticut is actually in forest, 60–70%. And silviculture actually means forest culture. So even though that's the most common land type we have here in Connecticut, most people will know. So hopefully one thing for students to take away pop quiz will be what silviculture is. It's German for woods culture. Coming from the Midwest, I had this impression that Connecticut was basically New York City. That's what I think a lot of us have come from out the region. And the real surprise is that Connecticut is heavily wooded from the center of Hartford into some of the denser suburbs and even into the exurbs. We have trees everywhere. Oops, I didn't want to go there, I got there already. And in fact, if you were to go on a hillside and look across the valley, you would never know this is standing over top of Cheshire, looking towards Wallingford and Meriden. We just trees really as much as stone walls to find the sense of place that is Connecticut. That's really cool. But there's some real threats to it. Some of you might have heard, like emerald ash borer. For those who are homeowners here in town, are probably paid to have at least one ash lost. Gypsy moths, which have been right in the fringe right here in Woodbridge of having gypsy moths. If you get over towards eastern Connecticut and Rhode Island, they have some places hundreds and a couple of places 1,000 acres of dead trees from gypsy moths. There's some scary ones on the road, possibly like Asian longhorn beetle, which if it was not controlled could end up killing all the maples in the eastern United States. They've controlled it pretty much in New York. The outbreak up in Massachusetts, they think they have it under control. It's hope. And
Is
with
that
those,
at the bottom?
huh?
Is that the longhorn beetle?
Yeah, that's the Asian longhorn beetle.
And that goes after the ash trees.
No, that goes after the maples.
Oh, the maples?
Emerald ash borer,
Okay.
I've never seen a beetle, and I live in Prospect, and I lived in Cheshire before, right next to where that initial outbreak was. And I had to remove 6 ash from my house before I sold it, and I never saw one beetle, even though I had the dead ash.
I lost a few.
The one thing we've all heard in the news is about, or commonly hear in the news, is about the wildfires that they have out west. It gets all the news because it's kind of dramatic. You see pictures of flame moving. Well, what we have here going on in the east is the green fire. It's not as dramatic as the wildfires out west, but it's every bit as damaging as what's happening. And a big part of that are invasive species. Japanese knotweed, that's the one that's common on the side of roads. It's got the great big heart-shaped leaf. You'll see the really dense thickets. It actually, some of them have a nice vanilla smell to them. The thing is, they would choke out all native vegetation. And they actually change street color too. Oriental bittersweet, which goes climbing up trees and chokes out trees. If you go back in the woods, that's another one which is a problem. Mugwort. When I came here 30 years ago, we didn't have any mugwort. If you go into a field now, you'll see that a lot of the fields are completely dominated by mugwort, which just can outcompete all of our native species. And I'll talk a little bit later why the invasives are a problem. And then, oops, not quite yet, garlic mustard, which is kind of annoying, but it's still out there. And then Japanese barberry, which is one of the things I'm going to focus on tonight. So just one quick thing when we talk about invasive species and non-natives and aliens and exotics, it's actually kind of not PC anymore to say aliens. Before that, it was not PC to say exotics, so now we're saying non-natives. But I just like aliens because I have a cute little figure for aliens when we talk about aliens. And the thing is, not all non-natives are invasives. A lot of us, our neighbors, have Norway spruce that are growing in our backyards. Norway spruce is not a native. Whether or not a native tree can be invasive really is a matter of debate. Now the question is, why are some non-natives become a problem? Well, that's because insects and diseases don't eat them. Why do we like planting things like Japanese barberry in front of our homes? Or burning bush? Or why did people plant Japanese knotweed? Well, they grow and nobody eats them, so they look good without taking any care of it. You don't have to take any care of it. But that's one of the real keys for why those things can spread and become a problem, because nobody eats them. And that includes deer, insects. They don't have any native pathogens that kill them, so it can become a problem. So when did they become a problem? Well, one of the things we've noticed for most invasive species, they're only a problem in an area with high deer herds. Deer, 100 years ago we had no deer, and now we have deer way beyond historic normals here in Connecticut. Very high deer herds. Down in this part of the state, especially if you're near a water company property, you could have 20 to 40 deer per square mile. Pre-European, we had 2 to 6 deer per square mile. So our deer populations are much, much higher than they used to be. But you need more than deer. You need to have a disturbance. And I don't know, has there been any tornadoes going through the region?
2 years ago,
Really?
or last year, yeah.
I was going to say. And we have things like emerald ash borer, which are causing widespread mortality. We've had some pockets of gypsy moth. Those of us who are older remember we used to have a lot of hemlocks around. And the hemlocks all got killed by the adelgid. And those all create openings out there that allow these invasives to go. And the non-natives can have a real impact on our ecosystem. They have, deer first. Deer have a real big impact on our ecosystems when there's too much of it. One, they increase growing space, which could be a good thing for new seedlings, because deer basically go out there and mow the understory. And when you have an open understory, that means there's a lot more moisture in the soil, there's a lot more nutrients, a lot more light coming in, so there's opportunity for new plants to grow. But the problem is for a lot of natives, especially for the native wildflowers, the deer will eat the flowers. They'll eat the leaves and they'll eat the seeds before they can fully develop. So those native plants really don't have an opportunity to reproduce, to grow again. And every plant has a lifespan. Some things, like trilliums, I think are really special. Trilliums actually take 16 years to become sexually mature. And then they can live for 80 years. So trilliums actually have a lifespan and a life cycle almost like ours. But if they aren't able to reproduce over that 80-year lifespan, then you won't have any more trilliums there. They eventually die. The other thing we found, and I'll touch a little more on this later because I think it's kind of funny, is deer can actually transport the seeds of invasive plants long distances. So if you ever go out in the woods in the middle of May, you know a wood should not look like this. You should not be able to see 200 yards through the woods. You should have some spring wildflowers out there. You should have a lot of dense saplings coming on there. The only thing you see in this woods, and this is a water company property, is Japanese barberry. There's actually a couple of multiflora rows stuck in. It's pretty sad. But deer damage goes beyond that. For those of us who like to grow our own veggies, and I love growing Swiss chard, well, if we can eat it, deer can eat it. And I can guarantee you, if you try to garden, if you have a lot of deer around you, you don't have a fence, you're not going to have any veggies. So I talked earlier about how deer can spread invasive species around. Well, we read this paper, and they ended up in New York, and they collected some deer poop, deer pellets, and they found out that they could get Japanese honeysuckle to grow out of it. And we were kind of curious, and we wanted an excuse to work in the greenhouse in the middle of winter. So that fall, and for the next 2 years, we went out and collected deer pellet groups. Here's a deer pellet group. And then we put it in the fridge for 3 months. And the reason why we put the pellet groups in the fridge for 3 months is a lot of seeds need cold treatment before they'll germinate. So we put them in the fridge for 3 months. We took them out in the greenhouse in the middle of January just to see what would grow out of it. And by gosh, we had things growing out of deer pellets. And not just a few little seedlings. We had over 11,000 germinates coming out of those deer pellets. 86 unique taxa. We couldn't get them all to species. It's amazing how many things come in there. There's actually, if you look in you read the scientific literature, there's a lot of reports. Everyone did this over in Africa because it's kind of neat to look at elephant poop and rhinoceros poop. Nobody really did it with deer poop, but we're kind of weird, we gotta say. And it's actually well known, a lot of seeds are actually designed to go through our digestive system. Things like raspberries and even cherries, they actually need an acid treatment before they'll germinate. So the sad thing is we found out that the majority of species that came through, 40% of the species we found of taxa were not native to the United States. Amazing. And 70% of the seedlings we found growing out of deer poop weren't native to the U.S. So deer were eating a lot of these non-native plants and were helping spread them across the landscape. And what were they spreading? Has anyone here ever heard of Japanese silkgrass? Just one hand? This is actually, I think, is one of the scarier invasives we have because it'll grow in forest shade. And I like to think of it as the crabgrass of the forest. And it's not only the forest now. In Fairfield County, it's so dense it's starting to move into people's yards. So they'll have crabgrass in the sunny part of their yard, and they'll have stilt grass in the shady part of their yard. Yeah. Oh, you have it? Yeah, I was going to say, I had to grow my yard when I was living in Cheshire. Luckily, I'm on the top of the hill of Prospect now. You know, we moved to a ranch, and I don't see it up there yet. But it's not just stiltgrass. Autumn olive. Autumn olive and a lot of our non-natives were actually brought and planted on purpose back in the 60s to promote wildlife. And autumn olive is one that USDA paid people to grow. They actually paid people to grow multiflora rose too. That was supposed to be the living fence. So you would never have to put barbed wire up again. You could just plant multiflora rose. And for those of us that like walking in the woods, there's nothing worse than walking through multiflora rose. One of the other ones, wine raspberry. At least wine raspberry has a really tasty berry to it. That's a raspberry that's got the really furry stem when you're looking on it. It is tasty, but deer won't eat it because it has too many hairs on it, or they won't eat very much of it. And then Japanese honeysuckle. And actually, there's some places down south where they still grow Japanese honeysuckle for deer food, and they used to promote people, they'd tell them to plant a half-acre Japanese honeysuckle because it brought in deer. But the only trouble is it brought in deer, deer would eat the seeds, and then disperse it throughout the rest of the landscape. Yeah, anyways, government sometimes have good ideas and sometimes we don't. So here's a long take-home message for you, and then I'm going to give you the short version. Is restoring native plant communities, which when we talk about controlling Japanese barberry, what we want to do is we want to restore native community in areas with both an established invasive shrubs like Japanese barberry and severe deer browsing. It's going to require an integrated management plan. It means you can't just go in with a silver bullet. Boom, you take care of it and you don't have a problem again. So what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to eliminate the recalcitrant invasive shrubs. Recalcitrant is just a $50 word that means really persistent, it's tough to kill. You're going to need to reduce deer density, or at least reduce the amount of browsing that goes on out there. Is that a normal whistle?
No, it's a fire call.
Oh, okay.
Volunteer fire.
And one of the things when you control invasives, if you have Japanese barberry down in this part of Connecticut, you're going to have other invasives out there. And if you control the barberry, chances are you're going to have something else coming in. And you might have to go out and treat it. So it could be a multi-year investment in time. Now, probably no one here has ever heard of Ralph Nyland. He was he's still alive. Ralph's in his mid-80s now, so he's pretty cantankerous, and he'll say exactly what he thinks. And he's the godfather of forestry for New York and New England, at least with northern hardwood. And here's what he says you have to do to get rid of invasives and actually for beech. You've got to shoot the deer, poison beech, and manage the light. That's exactly what he had in one of his slides. So he can be pretty blunt. He's pretty older now. But really what I like to soften it up a little bit, what we need to do is we need to stop browse damage. We need to reduce browse damage. Because the deer out there, they're eating all the native plants. That is growing space for the invasives to come in, and then they're bringing in the seeds from the invasives. We need to control the invasives, and one of the things it's sort of too late here with the ash trees. You need to treat before the canopy is cut or damaged, because once you get all that sunlight coming in, you ever notice that there's an explosion of growth afterwards in all those areas? You see that? So I was able to persuade my wife with the dinner to get in the middle of this Japanese barberry thicket. Pretty nasty, huh? I think that's about 30 acres up by Banham Lake. And here's the big question. Some people ask me, why should I care? I mean, it's green out there, right? One of my favorite ones, maybe you can't all read it in the back. Giz Fuzzy is a very sarcastic cartoon for those of you who like it. It says, welcome to the previews of my new horror movie, Be Ready to Scream. Napwork Films presents It Came From Connecticut, The Face of Evil, the arrow pointing down. How scary is that? I don't see anything there. That's why it's scary. It's Deer Tick, the movie. And deer ticks are pretty small. I'll show that in a second. So if you go into a typical Connecticut forest, there's about 10 ticks per acre that are carrying Lyme disease. So every one of these dancing ticks you're going to see represents 10 ticks per acre that are carrying Lyme disease. But if you go into a stand where there's a lot of invasive barberry, it's not 10 ticks per acre, it's not 50 ticks per acre, it's not 100 ticks per acre, it's almost 130 ticks per acre are carrying Lyme disease. Which means if you go out there, if your pets go out there, your horse goes out there, your kids, your grandkids go out there, there's that 13 times more ticks per acre carrying Lyme disease in areas with invasive species.
repeat that number again?
Sure. There's roughly, on average, a little over 10 ticks per acre carrying Lyme disease in a forest without invasives. In a forest with invasives, it's close to 130, which is kind of scary, very scary. Well, if you go out there and if you control the invasives, you can either use herbicides, or it's a lot more expensive but a lot more fun. Use propane torches.
To kill Japanese barberry, they
Yeah.
use torches.
Yeah. I'll show a little bit on that. We've actually given classes on that. It's kind of fun. It's a lot more work and it's a lot more expensive in terms of labor to get it done. But it is sort of satisfying, and my wife got me one for Christmas. So I actually have a full-size one and a mini one because I like herbiciding that way. You just have to make sure you do it on a wet day. So you can reduce within 1 year from 130 down to 40. And then gradually the numbers of ticks will go back to that baseline of 10 again.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said you're using herbicide, so you're spraying.
Yeah.
to get rid of it. What does that do for us if we have well water? What does that go into the?
If you use it responsibly, it doesn't do anything for your well water.
I
And
use it, my neighbor uses it, and everybody in my neighborhood uses it, and we're all on well water.
well, here's the nice thing about controlling invasives, and that's a great question. If you do it right and control it, you'll do it once. You don't do it year after year after year. And most of the herbicides are actually bound up by the organic matter and then are consumed by the soil microbes. Insecticides are different. Insecticides tend to be a lot more persistent. Herbicides are relatively short-lasting, except for Mazapir, and that doesn't have a lot of soil movement. That can persist for 2 years, but then it degrades down. So that's a great question. Yeah.
How about sterilizing all the deer?
Oh, I don't want to take a lot of time on that. There's actually an effort going on now in Staten Island where they're trying to sterilize every buck on the island.
There you go.
They thought there was 150. They found that there's over 800. It's also cost several $1,000s a deer. In New York City, they actually have to have a licensed veterinarian do every vasectomy. Cornell University, I just got done reading a paper that was published 2 days ago. Within Cornell University, they didn't want any honey. So what they did is they went out there and they tried to capture all the females and give them
Birth
tubal ligation, I guess is what you call them. Yeah, because they wanted them to still act like they wanted to breed, but not. That's why they give the bucks vasectomies. And they found that after 5 years, it's had zero impact on the population because does come in from the surrounding area and new fawns. So unless we were to do the entire eastern United States, it's not real practical.
Venison.
Huh? Well, one of the things, just I'll touch on this really briefly, other people said, why don't we give them contraceptives?
Right.
One of the problems with contraceptives is none of the contraceptives are labeled for people consuming the venison. So you would have to give the contraceptive and somehow mark every deer that for as long as that contraceptive is in their system, whether or not the meat is safe to eat. Now, it probably is, but are you going to necessarily want to eat it? And you can't put, some people suggested we'll put the contraceptives out there rather than giving an injection, we'll put out bait boxes. Well, I remember when my kids were little, and now with my grandkids, I sure as heck don't want some contraceptives out there where if I'm not paying attention, they're going to grab it and eat it. Because you've got to put these out like every couple acres. And what's the average home site here in town? Yeah, so it's almost one bait box per house because, we have wells and septic systems, so our houses are spread out. It just becomes a pretty risky proposition. So, just to try to get through this a little bit. So if you don't like to see dancing ticks, which forest do you want to try to walk through? And that doesn't include all the ticks that are not infected with barberry. I mean, infected with Lyme disease. And the reason why we're talking Lyme disease, is it accounts for about 75% of the diseases spread by arthropods, basically insects, and throughout the United States. There are some other ones that are becoming more prevalent now, but Lyme disease still counts for the most of it. And unfortunately here in Connecticut, we're right in the center of a whole bunch of tick diseases. Anaplasmosis, boom, we got it. Babesiosis, we got it. Lyme disease, we have it. And now they're saying there's 2 Borrelias out there. So there's Borrelia, the typical one, that Borrelia mammai. If somebody here is a physician, they can correct me on my pronunciation. We have ehrlichiosis. We don't have much Rocky Mountain spotted fever. That tends to be on ticks, spread by dog ticks, which were more commonly found when we had a lot more livestock. Tularemia, tick tularemia isn't real common. What is scary now is we do have the Lone Star tick in the state. And the Lone Star tick, certain percentage of people that are bitten by Lone Star tick, it has a protein alpha-gal, which only primates don't have that protein. All other mammals have that protein. And some people develop an allergy after they're bitten by that tick. And that prevents you from ever being able to eat mammal meat the rest of your life. You can eat poultry and fish, but you can never eat mammal, or else you can have anaphylactic shock, which is kind of scary. So that one, there's 2 established populations in Connecticut, and now there's this new one, the Asian longhorn tick, which doesn't even need a male, so the females can just reproduce on their own. Knock on wood, it tends to be more of a problem in areas with more livestock, so hopefully not as much of a problem here. So, beside invasives having more ticks, what else is kind of scary about it? Well, earthworms in our yards and our gardens are a great thing. Thomas Jefferson called it, the natural fertilizer we had out there. But our forests, because we're in a glaciated area, we really didn't have earthworm populations. We had a couple of small earthworms here and there, but almost every earthworm you're ever going to see out in the woods is a non-native earthworm. And the first earthworms that came here were fairly benign. But now we're getting some more aggressive earthworms out there, and they're completely stripping the soil away. So let me show you what happens. So we have earthworms in an area where there's a lot of invasives. And by the end of August, underneath the Japanese barberry stand, you do not see leaf litter. All you see are earthworm middens. You might say, well, what's the problem with that out in the woods? Well, a couple problems. One, if that's all the protection you have for the soil, that soil litter out there is actually acting like a blanket. It's really preventing soil erosion. It's protecting that soil. You start seeing sheet erosion. We should never have sheet erosion on Connecticut soils. It should never happen. And which especially should never happen, we've seen gullies forming in Connecticut woods. That's something you usually see in agricultural areas, or in really steep mountains in agricultural areas with a lot of things. So we're seeing that in areas with invasive species. And that becomes a problem because all that soil from the sheet erosion, all that soil from the gully erosion gets washed down into our rivers. The sediment carries down phosphorus, the sediment helps pollute the water just by itself, and it helps bring down nitrates into our water. So it really lowers the quality of our riparian areas by having those barberry, having more earthworms, and then having impact on the rivers. Like I sort of mentioned, I'll mention again, there's this sort of devil's triangle of too many deer, invasive species, and then they eat the native vegetation. That's an 11-year-old white pine on a water company property we planted growing in full sunlight. There's no way that you plant a pine tree in full sunlight that 11 years later it should be that big. And here you can see inside and outside of a fence. Here's outside of the fence looking from one direction and outside looking the other. Inside the fence, this is after 2 years. See how we've got all the vegetation coming back up where the deer aren't hitting it? And that native vegetation can shade out a lot of the invasives. The other thing, when we lose the leaf litter, when we have too many deer, we start losing a lot of our native wildflowers. And maybe I'm weird, I sort of like the beginning of winter, I like the first snowfall, it looks kind of pretty and all that. But by the end of March, beginning of April, that first day we get in the 70s, especially when the wildflowers come out, how many people are out on the trails? Or those of us who live near one of the linear pathways, the old railroad ones, those places are packed. And why? We're out there to see the wildflowers in part, to enjoy the sunshine. I mean, things like bloodroot, French polygale, which is one of my favorite. Later on, pink lady slipper, herb robber. And this one actually just faded away about 3 weeks ago, fringe gentian. All these plants we lose when we have too many invasives and too many deer. So, okay, we lose some pretty plants. What's the big deal? Well, one of the things that's been in the news have been native pollinators. And native pollinators need flowers that are flowering throughout the year. One of the problems if you have this whole forest full of Japanese barberry, and all flowers mid-May, third week in May, flowers for a week or so, and boom, then there's no more flowers. So for a week, couple weeks, pollinators are doing great. There's more flowers than they know what to do with. But what do they do the rest of the year? There's nothing out there for them. It's one reason why we want to have a diversity of species out there and diversity of flowers. Same thing with too many deer. We don't have any new trees. I was talking about an area where invasives could come in. We were kind of curious. We watched this for a couple of years, sugar maple seedlings. So we pulled up half a dozen of them, cut them with a razor blade, and looked at them under a microscope. 17 years old. And actually about 5 years later, all these maples eventually died and are all replaced with Japanese stiltgrass. Or you could get what they have common in Pennsylvania, these vast ferneries. We can literally see in some places 100, 200 yards through the woods with no shrubs. So you can ignore this part. This is more than a matter for me to remember. So we actually did this study, 4 places throughout Connecticut. And we looked what would happen to the native invasive shrubs if we just prevented deer from browsing on them. So we have inside the exclusion where deer couldn't get them and outside the exclusion. You know what? It made no difference. Once these invasive shrubs, and that's the Japanese barberry growing in that area, once they're established, they don't die. They just persist and persist, whether or not there's any deer. What happens if you just go in there and you just mow them down? So we mow down the invasive shrubs. And again, well, you know what? Within a couple of years, I'll show you in a little more detail, they come right back, whether or not there's deer. And that's because these shrubs all resprout when you cut them down. If you go in there and if you control it with just propane torches, you go back 2-3 times and make sure you got them killed, or you go in once with herbicide, then there's a difference. So that's why I keep talking about you have to do deer and the invasives. If you, outside the fence where we controlled the invasives, but we still allow deer, we ended up with the savanna coming out here, with just low grasses. Inside we actually have this, like I say, crazy world of all this native vegetation coming back in. But you got to go after both things, not just one. So just show you an example. Like here's an area where we, this is second week in May when the barberry is really starting to leaf out. So the barberry is greening out, and here's where we mowed it over here. Four months later, the barberry all resprouted, came right back. Within 2 years, it's already up to knee high or a little bit higher. 4 years later, it's now up to almost waist high again. And eventually it's going to go back to one of these really dense barberry thickets. So just mowing it is not going to be the answer for it. So if we looked at areas where we mowed it, and then we protected it from deer, and we did follow-up treatments, you can see we actually had difference between inside and outside the fences. And these are areas where the barberry, like I said, will also have follow-up treatment. And just a very big difference over time. Inside the fences where the barberry is completely controlled, we had these beautiful native forests coming back in. So speed it up just a little. The other thing about deer, and you have it on here, is deer can actually, by eating all the native stuff, can have a real severe impact on ground nesting and shrub nesting bird species. Getting back to the non-natives, one of the things we worry about is, I don't know how many of you ever heard of Doug Tallamy's book, Bringing Nature Home? It's been an incredibly influential book. One of the things they talk on there, reason why we don't like non-natives out there, is things like Coosa dogwood. And I'll admit, I have one growing in my house. There's 0 native bugs on Coosa dogwood. On flowering dogwoods, there's 117 of butterflies and moths. One of the things you don't think about are even forest interior birds, but all birds, when they have nestlings and fledglings, they need a lot of protein for those baby birds to develop. Their primary source of protein for those baby birds are caterpillars that are feeding on native species. While we have a forest full of invasive species, non-native species, there's no caterpillars out there for them. It looks green, it looks great, but it's a food desert for the birds. There's nothing out there for them to eat. And here's a really scary place. You might have heard of Charles Island. Somebody every year or two dies walking back and forth to get caught by the tide out there. Well, this had, I think it was 17 deer in the 16 acres they had out there, 750 deer per square mile, which would be equivalent, imagine how big your property is if you own your own house. For every 1 acre you own, you had a deer on your property all the time, year round. Imagine the damage it would do. So on this 16-acre island, I think we found 2 red maple, a black cherry, and a couple sassafras. Everything else out there, well, there's a 5-acre patch of Norway maple, and everything else was Atlantis, non-native. The understory was barberry and honeysuckle. The vines in the trees were all bittersweet and honeysuckle. And the question is, what do you do? That's one of the things you asked me to talk about when we get to. What the heck can you do in a place like that? Well, I just want to acknowledge we had a lot of people helped us with this, both with funding and a lot of manpower and a lot of land donated. And a lot of us worked on it. Scott, who's the co-author in this, Megan, who's now a postdoc, Tom Worthley up at UConn, and JP and Mike are techs. And we went out there and we measured everything. We counted herbs and regeneration. We did estimates of barberry cover. We dragged for ticks. We counted in the one study, every barberry clump, we measured every stem, its diameter and height, trying to find out so we can give good things. And when I give you results, I'm not talking about some real little study we did sort of out there. We had 28 study areas, 149 plots, and we treated 122 acres to try to really figure out what's the most cost-effective way of doing it, give people options. And we looked at 56 different treatment and timing options. So the take-home message for this was practical for a lot of places, and probably for the land trust or town properties here. It's a 2-step process, and you can even start it right now. So you start with a bush that's this big, right? What you do is you mow it down. Now I'll show you some different ways you can do it. You kill everything above ground. We used to think you had to rake it all up and do that. You don't have to do any of that. That's a lot of extra work. You mow it down. And what happens whenever you mow something, when you cut something down? They re-sprout back up, right? But here's the nice thing about when they re-sprout. You're forcing that plant to use all of its energy reserves that it has stored underground. It's got to use them to grow up. You're weakening the plant. Sometimes people have actually gone back and mowed that a second time to really weaken the plant. So now instead of this big plant, which was in some cases 6 feet high and 6 feet high, now we've got this little plant that's a foot high. So now if we're going to go out there and apply herbicide, we're just doing this little spot treatment. Or if we're using a propane torch, we're just treating a really small area. We're not trying to treat this huge area. And that'll work for areas with smaller areas in size. And it really doesn't matter what you use to kill the top thing. We've used brush saws, DR mowers work a lot better in a meadow than they do in the woods. They don't work real well in the woods. If you have money and it's really entertaining, is to drive a skid steer through the woods with a Fecon chopper in front. That's the same thing you might have seen actually just chews up entire trees. $600 a day and they could do 720s in the snow. They are fun. We've actually used prescribed fire, probably not an option here in town. And we've used propane torches just to kill them. And the second step, you come in and you kill the sprouts. You can either use propane, we found tripicore's effective, so is glyphosate. Now, propane torches are really useful in wetland areas. Because one of the things we were doing this research, my boss said, Jeff, this sounds like interesting research. We're going to let you use fire. If you set the woods on fire and the house burns down, you're fired. No, that's an experiment station. Lou Rangarelli told me. So you want to be really careful. In a wetland area, you don't have to worry about starting a fire. We had some that were smoking, and we spent 2 hours on one of them trying to get out every smoker. It's great for small patches or park. The one thing is you want a volunteer labor pool, because I'm going to show you it can be very expensive as far as the amount of labor used. And the leaf litter has to be damp. The big thing to realize is you can start a fire with it. The other big thing to realize, like a chainsaw, a propane torch is a useful tool, but it can be dangerous because the tip of that, the metal, can get close to 2,000 degrees. And it'd be very easy to get a pretty severe burn by bumping that up against your skin. And I think you should consider herbicide if you have clumps that are larger than 4 feet high. Propane torches don't work as well in those because they have such large roots with such large amounts of root reserves. You're going to have to go out there and do it for a couple of years, like 2 or 3 times a year with a propane torch. If it's growing in the full sun, it just does not work. If there's other invasives present, unless you want to go through and torch every single invasive, and where cost is important, the one thing you have to be really careful with anytime you use an herbicide is overspray. And that means spraying, not just hitting your target plant, but hitting wildflowers and tree regeneration. Remember, what's our goal out there getting rid of barberry, other invasive species? We want to restore the native ecosystem, right? And if we're out there killing our native plants, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot. So you might consider mist blowing in dense infestations. We used this in a place over in Old Lyme where they had 100 acres of barberry. And it was 100 acres like this. Unbelievable. So here in town, the land trust wants to control invasives. They've got 40 hours of labor. People are willing to donate 40 hours, or they can pay for 40 hours. And you have 35% invasive cover. And actually, if you look at how the chairs are in this room, especially in the table, and if you consider spaces between the chairs, the chairs are about 35% cover. So you might think, oh, it's half of it. You've got to remember there's spaces in between it. So when we do cover, we do like the science geek way of doing cover. So here's how many acres you can treat with that amount. If you just use propane, which would be kind of silly, only 1 acre. If you cut it down first, let it regrow and use propane, you can do 2 acres. If you cut it and then use herbicide spot treatments, when it regrows, you can do about 4.2. If you get out there and spray with a backpass mist blower and let God sort them out, you can do 10 acres. So it's a cost-benefit thing. We just give people options. We don't tell you which option to choose. One of the other things I talked about is you want to treat the canopy before it's cut. So this is probably what a lot of the woods look like where emerald ash borer had gone through if you have a deer herd. This is a shelter woodcut that they had put in 15 years before. The only thing growing underneath here are invasive species. I mean, that should just be this dense tangle that you literally have to, you might think it's silly, but one of the easiest ways we found to walk through dense, small trees is to actually do the breaststroke. It's a great way of walking through those stands. And here's a 15-year-old clear cut, and it probably just looks like a green wall. Trust me on this, it's all invasive species except for some hopworm beam that are poking their way through it. So the take-home message, the short version again, is stop browse damage. If you're going to go after invasives, if you don't control the deer, you're wasting your time. Don't even bother. Control invasives, then you want to make sure you do it before the canopy is cut. I mean, it is kind of cute. That's one of my neighbors, the deer in the front yard. They are cute out there, aren't they? Until they start eating your roses and veggies.
Hostas.
In place places where that plant is indigenous, is that all there is, or those Japanese?
No, because they have insects and diseases that control them over there. What's kind of interesting is over in Europe, our rhododendron and the Asian rhododendrons in Ireland, that's their big invasive species. In France, their big invasive species is our black cherry. Which, you know how we have Phragmites, that tall grass that grows everywhere? That's an invasive species. And it's replacing all of our Spartina, you know, the short grass. It's interesting, in China, they have the opposite problem. All of our Spartina is replacing their Phragmites. Because there's no insects or diseases that control it. So when are invasives and insects a problem? I said before, it's when you have deer, when you have a disturbance, but this is a great movie for those of us of a certain age. It's a little bit complicated because when you have no deer at all, things like multiflora rose, Oriental bittersweet, and Japanese honeysuckle can actually go nuts. So in the exposures where we didn't allow any deer, after a while we actually started having even more of a problem because we had 0 deer. So you want some deer out there, but you just don't want to have too many. And be afraid about Japanese stiltgrass, especially along the trails. If I've ever said one species, I would say jump early and jump ugly, is wherever you have a trail system and people bring in their bikes, their hiking shoes, is look for Japanese stiltgrass infestations and control them as soon as you see them, and control them completely. Otherwise, you'll be, I know I keep doing the water company because they're nearby here. They've lost a couple of their watersheds to Japanese stiltgrass. Until a biological control comes along, they will never have control of those watersheds again.
What do you mean by that? So,
What's that?
what do you mean control them?
By out of control, I mean basically the stiltgrass is forming a carpet. They're losing all the native wildflowers, all the native herbs. They're having real problems with forest regeneration. Because stiltgrass, once it gets any sun at all, can get up about this high, and it just forms this dense mat that just shades out everything else. Deer won't eat it because it has a lot of silicone in it. I've actually tried it, I read it, and it grates on your teeth when you eat it. So it's sort of nasty that way. So let's get a little positive here though. So going forward, plant native species in your backyard. There's some great, or at least non-invasive, there's some great species out there. You want red color? Look at some of the native blueberries, especially the low bush blueberries. They have great fall color. I mean, sumac has a great fall color if you've got a bigger area in full sun. It is a little bit aggressive. But you know, the mountain laurels, you know, there's honeys, that's huckleberry. Huckleberry's got a great fall color. And if you've never eaten huckleberries, they're every bit as tasty as blueberries.
And what are the other plants?
Well, this is just the pink variety of flowering dogwood.
Okay.
Mountain laurel, redbud, really, it's native close by. But huckleberry, but there's a lot of nice native ones. How many people here have ever been to our farm over in Hamden? Okay, most of you. Have you been to the native woody shrub collection? The native woody shrub collection we have there was planted back in 1964. The same year as, what was a really influential book? What's that?
Silent Spring?
Silent Spring. Because of Rachel Carson's book, we planted a native woody shrub collection back in '64. You can see native woody shrubs which have never been irrigated, never been fertilized, and never treated for pesticides. And see how you can have those native shrubs as the backbone, you know, the structure of your garden, and then you can plant other things for color. And you know, there's not only the mountain laurels, but the Pieris, you know, that's got Andromeda, that's got some nice ones. Carrie is not native, but it's got some nice fall color as opposed to everybody growing for Cynthia. Luckily, butterfly bush isn't invasive here. Out west, butterfly bush, I think it's now listed in Oregon because it's invasive in Oregon. Going forward, one of the things you guys are talking about doing here, contribute to community efforts. There's been some limited town efforts to do it. This is actually up in West Hartford, it's done it. Mansfield has done it together. It really takes, there's actually an effort along the Housatonic River to get rid of Japanese knotweed. What it takes is that one, I'm saying this in a positive way, irritating person who stays on it and stays on it and organizes people and brings people in there and brings some cookies and donuts to keep them coming and keep them. It really takes that one motivated person or a small group of them and keeps it on, because it's not a one-time effort. You can't just go out there, even if you're going to use herbicide, you're going crazy. And you're spraying herbicide across the entire landscape. A, you're not going to get everything. B, you're going to have something else coming back. Besides the fact, I think it's a horrible way of doing it. It's a multi-year effort. It's like if you're a gardener, and I imagine a bunch of us here are gardeners. You weed your garden 1 year, the weed's gone, you never have to weed again? If only, right? You've always got to be out there weeding. So it really takes, a whole community to do this. This is my sort of forestry plug, Save the Siberian Tiger. A lot of the wood that you buy from furniture that comes from China, especially the oak, actually comes from the Russian forest, oak forests, which are being cut. And it's one of the reasons why the Siberian tiger is under a bit of threat, because of encroachment into their habitat. Buy local. Be a locavore with your wood products. We have pretty responsible forestry here. And I always put this, support research. So just one thing, you can't control invasives. Like I said, it's a multi-year process. And the good thing is when you control invasives, you can zap the ticks. So with that, I have time for a few questions. Sure.
We have thousands of barberry bushes behind where we live.
Yeah.
They line the Blue Trail. And in the middle of these bushes is the Scout House. How do we address that? They already told me they don't have a staff.
What I always suggest to people is one of the first things we can do, and so you can also have positive feedback, is maybe do 20, 30 feet wide on each side of the trail. Mow that down. Come back the next year. Maybe mow that down a second time to expand it.
Can't mow. It's all under a canopy and it's all very crowded.
Well, what we use for, did I show a picture there? What we use for mowing is you can mow everywhere, but you don't use a mower. You use not a string trimmer, there's actually a brush saw. You wear the shoulder harness. And you don't want to use a saw blade, you actually want to use like a blade that's like a three-pointed blade. Our saw blade, we had to sharpen every 2 hours. In 2 years, we've yet to sharpen our other blade. And it just tears through barberry. It's kind of nice, sometimes barberry's like this big and this far, and to try to get to the base, you have to walk into the prickers. What's nice with that three-sided one, can everybody sort of see what I'm talking about? Like one up, one down, and one like here. Sort of like the Mercedes-Benz symbol. If you can imagine that, spinning around. And we use that like the Vegematic, where you just lift the blade, you go up and down, and you cut a path right to the center of the barberry, and then you cut it down. One reason why with mechanical control, or any of them, you won't get every one, is Japanese barberry layers. When a branch touches the ground, and we'll see a tree branch falls on it, and then some leaves, that branch will actually set new roots. So barberry can creep across the landscape like a fungus. But what I would say is, if there's a brush saw, and I know some people have done this on their own properties, is they'll just expand out little by little. And they want to minimize herbicides, so they'll cut it the first year, the next year they'll go back and cut the ones where they cut before, and they'll cut a little bit wider. And they'll do it little by little, and then if they have to, eventually they go out there and spot treat with herbicide. You're not going to treat the whole area at once unless you've got big bucks. Yes?
Just to know, what herbicides do you recommend?
I don't recommend any, I'm not allowed to. I just say the ones we found have been effective have been Tripiclur, and you're going to go like this at me, and glyphosate.
And what was the other one?
Glyphosate.
Can you spell
That's the active ingredient in Roundup.
that?
I'm not going to get into that debate. 2,4-D does not work. We have not found it works. I mean, there's another one that works, but there's a risk of killing trees, so unless you really know what you're doing, I wouldn't recommend it. Those are the two that we know work. Yeah,
What do you use for personal spray against ticks when you're outside?
that's actually a great question. What do we use for personal spray? In my department, we had 1 or 2 people were getting a tick-borne disease every year. And 3 years ago, I made the decision that everybody in my department, including summer seasonals, must wear treated clothes or you cannot go out in the woods. For me, it's like using a chainsaw without using chaps and a hard hat. For DEP now, they are buying all of their foresters and wildlife folks, they're buying them, I think it's Perithrin? Yeah, whatever the heck it is, the clothing which already has the insecticide infused into it. We buy the spray and treat our own and do it every couple of months.
They're saying now that ticks that the frost doesn't stop them anymore.
Never has.
And they're also that it's sort of like, that it can come back at you, kind of like, what's the rash that you get on one side that they're allergic?
Bullseye?
No.
Shingles.
Shingles, it's like shingles, it can come back, like they treat you with that.
That's another debate, and I'm not an MD, so I'm not going to get into that debate. There's, like I said, that's way beyond my area of expertise. So I know there is disagreement on whether or not doxycycline works, whether or not you have to go through a multi-month treatment regimen. There are some good evidence that there could be some bacteria, in fact, could escape some of the early doses of doxycycline. There's also some people, apparently the protein, which can trigger the allergic reaction, all the other ones from the bacteria can persist in the system long after bacteria is killed. You'd have to ask somebody to come in, and I would get somebody on both sides of that issue because it's pretty contentious. But to answer your other question you asked about frost and cold, ticks do not die in the winter. They hang out in the leaf litter on warm days. I picked up ticks in the middle of January. You get a couple warm days, they come right back up. They're hungry.
What about spraying your property?
That's a personal decision to make.
Okay, but is it effective?
From what I've heard, that's not my area. From what I've heard it is, I would actually suggest you can look on our site. There's Kirby Stafford wrote one, the tick handbook, is I would do a defensive perimeter, which is keep your grass mowed, keep the shrubs so it doesn't appear shrubs next to your property. Put wood chips on the perimeter first. They are, it looks like they, I think, Cameron, don't quote me on this, but I think that the trials that they're doing with a fungicide for tick control are working. I'm just not positive. I thought there was a question over here, yeah.
So we have a bunch of walking trails, and I have 2 questions. One of them is, many of us walk our dogs on these
Yeah.
trails. Would there be an ill effect on animals, pets, if we were to try to use some of these herbicides?
Now if you were to mow it down, that's one of the reasons I talk about is mow it down, reduce the size, so then you're doing a small spot treatment, and then it's gone. You're doing it a one-time thing. You put the sign out there. The people where there's been some concerns about them getting cancer, people are agricultural workers who are spraying this multiple times a year over decades. So what we're talking about, and I mean what I've done on my own property where I've had to do treatment, is I'll do a small spot treatment. Or if I have something, I'll cut down a tree, this is an invasive one. I'll actually get a paintbrush, I'll put in a couple of drops of food coloring so I can know which ones, because I'm doing a bunch. I'll go out and I'll paint the stump. That way I know it's just on the stump, it goes into the root system. I don't have to worry about, killing everything else around it.
And then, just an aside, I know in walking around, and actually on my own property, I've got all kinds of vegetation and things
Yeah.
growing in the wooded area. And is there a quick, easy way to spot the barberry, as opposed to saying, oh, this leaf is, or whatever? I mean, what are some good, fast identifiers?
Okay, we just passed a little bit. When you go out in the spring, if you go out in mid-April, there's really going to be 2 things which are going to be starting to leaf pretty early. You're gonna have spice bush is gonna leaf up pretty early, but that's the one that's in swamps. It sort of smells like Old Spice. Old Spice aftershave. And then there's the non-natives are gonna be the other ones that are leafing out. Barberry is pretty easy because it's got spines on it. So if you see something that's leafing out early and it's got really small spines, it's barberry. Yeah, because rose doesn't leaf out until sometime in May. And, you know, rose looks like, multiflora rose looks like a rose unless you know exactly what you're looking for.
Coloration, does it vary from season to season?
Well, I mean, I can see the colors, but unless you're used to telling between light lime green and regular green, it's a little bit tougher. So I can't really give you a key on that. And this time of year, it's going to have red berries on it too, and spines.
Yeah.
And you can use the red berries if you're ever curious. There's some Turkish and Korean recipes called for using barberry. So go for it.
Hi.
Two more questions.
The spraying for tick control, that's those companies that come in and spray, is that effective or?
I believe it is. Like I say, it's not my area. I've
Okay.
never had it treated. You can call down the station and ask. I'm pretty sure it is effective. I just
Okay.
don't know, and I can't believe people keep the pay if it wasn't effective. Let me take one more, and then I'll wait if somebody wants to come up. Sure,
I know I have like a ton of this barberry out there.
sure.
But I also, wetlands.
You also what?
Wetlands,
Yeah.
and when I called in people to come and help me clear, they're like, we can't, because wetlands won't let me go in there. So I get contractors that come in that don't want to go in because it's wetlands, and I gotta get the wetlands to come in and approve it, because then they get kind of funky when you start removing stuff. They're really, at least in this town, they're like really aggressive, in the wetland people here. So I have contractors that won't come until wetlands come in and look at it.
Really? See,
Yeah.
I could understand if they didn't want any equipment going in there, but I couldn't see why they would have a problem with somebody with a brush saw.
Well, I don't know what they're gonna use, but 2 years ago, I tried to get something cleared out and done, and they were like, oh
Yeah.
no, there's wetlands, we can't go in, you gotta get approval, and, you know.
Ooh, town politics, it's
Yeah.
always so easy.
So, I mean, if you wanna come and use my property's experiment, I'll give you my address. You guys can take over.
I tell you, unless we get more money, I'm close enough
Take
to
over. I
retirement.
donate my property to science.
No, in all seriousness,
Yeah.
maybe somebody here could offer you some advice or know somebody in wetlands.
Yeah.
I would think they wouldn't have a problem with mowing down an invasive species in a wetland.
Well, maybe I'll take that approach now, see, it's invasive.
Yeah.
I need to mow it.
And if you email me theirs, I'll go back. On there, I can actually send you a control booklet, which will give the summary of like how many ticks and all that. Email me and I'll send you a PDF of
My
it.
dog has had Lyme disease and, you know.
Yeah, I fully understand. Like I said, I've gotten rid of the barberry, even though it's native. I got rid of the poison ivy because I got grandkids. So I'll tell you what. Thank you. I'll stay up here if anybody else has any questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you again for coming.
Pleasure.
Our meeting is adjourned and it's 7:10. Thank you.